Yeah.
Lord Meghnad Desai and fellows of the Institute and friends, it's a great privilege that the last of our academic activities for our term, which finishes tomorrow, as you all know, is this talk in our distinguished lecture series by Lord Meghnad Desai. You've already heard the topic of his talk, which is Global Heteropolarity and the New World Order. I'll say a few words about the topic in a moment, but before that, it gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome as well as introduce Lord Meghnad Desai. I'm going to say a few words about him, but I also want to say a few words about his book, which I finished reading Sunday morning.
Oh, wow.
And my wife,
Sleepless nights.
it's a great read. And my wife was saying that, can you give up the book and do some other things? Because I got the book on Saturday and I finished it by Sunday morning, or I got it Friday evening. So I just read it through. So I'm going to say a few words about the book. But first, a bit of introduction. As we all know, Lord Desai is a familiar figure on Indian television, especially when it comes to election analysis. And this book will tell you why. I don't want to be a spoiler, but he predicted elections so accurately, including the loss of NDA and the Vajpayee government, the return of UPA, where nobody knew that India shining was not going to be all that shiny. He predicted that right. Then he also predicted the victory of Narendra Modi ji in 2014. And in 2019, I can bear witness because both of us were on the same panel with WION TV. And his numbers, though I must say he was a bit off, I think he predicted 243. And I think the government came back with a thumping 303 majority. But it was then that I made his acquaintance. And I must say that though he's a life peer, he has never forgotten and he has supped with prime ministers and presidents and so forth. The book has photos of his with our current prime minister, with the president, with Dr. Manmohan Singh and many other dignitaries. He organized a wonderful talk by Bill Clinton. But despite of all of his great fame, he also coined, or was one of the main people to coin the idea of the Human Development Index as a different way to capture how well nations were doing other than just GDP. So, highly distinguished professor at London School of Economics, 38 years he taught at LSE, his PhD is from University of Pennsylvania, and he's taught in many continents in the world. So highly distinguished. And one of his great achievements was the Gandhi statue on Parliament Street. So that's also in this book, how he raised money for it. And I'm proud to say that the majority of the funds, or the large portion of the funds, came from Indian industrialists. In fact, Rahul Bajaj, whose family, Jamnalal Bajaj, etc., was associated with Gandhiji, himself opened his purse strings to Lord Desai. So it's a fascinating read. But what I wanted to say is he's so down to earth, he's so warm hearted, he's a polymath. And in the 8th decade of his life, he has taken to painting. He does acrylics. I haven't seen the paintings, but he's a theater buff. When he was a student at Ruya College, he was very active in the literary and cultural scene in Mumbai. He knew major writers such as Dilip Chitre, they were his friends. He was instrumental in staging Ibsen, Pinter, and all the modern plays in Mumbai. After moving to London, he continued his love affair with theatre and literature. And when I called him a few days ago, I said, Lord Desai, you're ensconced all by yourself in London. What do you do? He said, I have read all the 37 plays of Shakespeare again. I'm reading Dickens, I'm reading the classics, and he's writing a very big book, one of the biggest books in his life, I think. It's still in the offing. So he's a polymath, and he has a special connection with Himachal. In his younger days, when he was in Delhi School of Economics, he used to trek in the Himalayas, and he's trekked many times in Manali. He loves Himachal Pradesh. That is also in the book. So though he's a rebellious lord, I would also say that he's a very down-to-earth and warm-hearted human being. So I just want to say a couple of words about his book, which is a fascinating read. And, we are all writers here, so we always think about alternate titles. So, Lord Desai, one of the alternate titles for your book is Lucky in Love and Life, because
Oh.
he's had a charmed life. The other title I had is Not Out at 80 and Looking Forward to the Century. I say that because there are cricket metaphors in the book. I have, when he went to London School of Economics, he started playing cricket again, and he describes himself very modestly here as a useful batsman. And why does he say that? Because nobody could get him out. He could bat through the day, and what is funny is that on the sidelines of his cricket matches, he organized wonderful new courses at London School of Economics. So, so that's a very fascinating part of his life. And here I'll read you two or three excerpts. So this is on page 125. He said that uh, I welcomed any chance to play cricket that came my way in London. LSE had a staff cricket team. One or two were serious players and had been playing for county junior sides over Oxbridge Blues. The rest were moderately competent. Then he goes back to his college days. At Ruya, again, there were formidable players. Ajit Wadekar, though a few years junior, is a good indicator of the sort of players Ruya got. It was only after I'd done my BA that I got a chance to play proper cricket with pads and gloves. I found I was good and managed to bat all day for my side. We played against another department without getting out. At Penn again, there had been no chance to play, though there were cricket teams playing in Philadelphia. So he says that he was a useful batsman. He also tried his hand later at bowling. So this is an enjoyable part of the book, of how he played cricket when he was at LSE. I want to read you another very fascinating part of the book, where he goes through, he was at a very exciting juncture at LSE in 67 when the student protests broke out in Paris. There were anti Vietnam protests in the US. And Lord Desai was very much a leftist, a socialist, a member of the Labour Party. He was good at campaigning and planning elections, but he was always a maverick. So he contributed with the so-called right-wing economic historian Dharma Kumar in the Cambridge Economic History of India, and he was slammed by all the leftists for doing that. So he's not just a rebellious lord; I would call him a maverick lord. So I want to talk about, the troubles at LSE, where he was then elected the honorary president of the LSE Student Union, and was very much a part of demonstrations. At one time near Trafalgar Square, he was cornered in a small corner garden, and then he vowed never to join demonstrations, but quietly do his work as he knew best, which was by reading. Now, I want to also point to another wonderful passage when, he spent some time at the Delhi School of Economics. Amartya Sen is there, and then Amartya Sen is hired by LSE for a very distinguished professorship at a very early age. And later, I.G. Patel, who was governor of the Reserve Bank of India and then seconded to the UN, became the director of LSE. So, London School of Economics was a very cosmopolitan, open kind of place, and Lord Desai thrived there. But in a stint in Delhi, he lived in Model Town. They took up an apartment there, and he recounts those days. And there were great days for Delhi School of Economics. There were wonderful people there, such as Krishna Raj, Sukhamay Chakravarti, and a host of other distinguished economists in India. Mrinal Datta Chaudhary, Khalik Naqvi, Tapan Rai Chaudhary, Dharma Kumar, most of them, except the last, Dharma Kumar, were all left wing. And one day he had this fascinating encounter with Ranajit Guha, whom we all know later as the founder of subaltern studies. Of course, Professor Guha was then at the Delhi School of Economics. He then went later to Canberra, to ANU. But one day he comes to the office of Lord Desai and his first wife, Gail, is sitting with him. And he says, Lord Desai, I want to have a word with you. Gail leaves the room. And here's the passage I want you to, hear. So he says, um, anyhow, Ranjit came to my office one afternoon looking very serious. He noticed that Gail was working in the same room, but indicated that he wished to speak to me privately. So Gail withdrew and we were left alone. Ranjit then spoke very seriously to me. Some of us think that the democratic path is not the one where the future lies, and the time has come for some serious action. I want to ask if you were prepared to join us. So Lord Desai thinks that Ranjit Guha is planning an armed insurrection. And he says, oh, wow, there must be something serious going on. And so he says, so I replied, that is, Lord Desai replies, of course, count on me to do whatever was asked of me, he says. And then this is what Professor Guha says. He then floored me by saying, we are starting a theoretical journal on the revolutionary alternative. We want you to write for it. So I think there's a delicious irony in that passage where Indian intellectuals thought they could usher in a revolution by starting a theoretical journal. So this fascinating book captures a lot of these moments which are worth recording for posterity. I want to now mention one last important moment in this book, after which we can segue to our topic today, which is the heteropolar world. And I think this passage that I'm talking about actually reflects, the concerns that all of us have about the new world order. And here is where you will see Lord Desai as a very original thinker. He cannot be boxed into any category because he starts, I mean, his first book was on Marx, he wrote a very important book on Marx. And then he went on to write a number of extremely important books, and yet he kept growing, he kept changing his stance with time. And here is where, you see, we are talking about the Cold War, and a lot of people still believed that in the fight between capitalism and socialism, capitalism would be destroyed. Capitalism, through its internal contradictions, would in some ways collapse. And that hope continued. Of course, that hope then, I think, turned into a delusion. So Lord Desai formulated the issue in three different kinds of socialism. He said, this is on page, I think, 254. His formulations are as follows: socialism within capitalism, which was the second international democratic socialism idea of humanizing capitalism through reform. Now, after the Soviet Union collapsed, if you start reading the issues of New Left Review, that's what they say. They say bourgeois democracy has to be critiqued from within. So here's the position number one: socialism within capitalism. Then his second position is socialism outside capitalism, which is what the Russians tried and failed at. Karl Marx's idea of socialism, however, was different, says Lord Desai. He believed that socialism would come only after capitalism. So here are three ideas: socialism within capitalism, socialism outside capitalism, and socialism after capitalism. And if you look at how the world events have shaped up, see, China has become a state-sponsored capitalist regime. The state has created private capital and private property after taking over. After abolishing private property during Mao's time. So, what I'm trying to simply say as a prelude to our talk today is that we have, some of us have lived through the Cold War, and we have seen the bipolar world, the first world, the second world. And I say bipolar because the third world was a non starter. Though the Bandung conference, I've been to Bandung myself and looked at the archives in Indonesia. They're very fascinating. But in some ways, it was a non-starter because the non-aligned movement never commanded that heft, either in terms of military power or economic power, to actually become the third pole. But let's say it was a second or two and a half pole world. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Huntington thesis, and so forth, people thought we were moving towards a unipolar world, with the triumph of capitalism. And of course, now with the rise of China and the decline of the United States, people have started talking about a multipolar world, which would be possibly a more fair and just world order. But is that what is happening? Or are we seeing heteropolarity? By the way, this idea of heteropolarity was suggested by Ram Madhavji, and he said, please have a conference on this, because the point is that the world today is not just multipolar, but it has different degrees and kinds of power and agents. The UN and the Bretton Woods institutions seem to have lost some of their power and influence. Instead, you have private philanthropy. I mean, imagine the power that people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or the Soros Foundations, or even the Omidyar Network have. Or look at the power of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and some of these platforms, so much so that governments are trying to moderate and regulate them. Look at the power of whistleblowers like Assange and some of these others who can leak data. Today, we've seen that there are thousands and thousands of supposedly Communist Party of China workers who have infiltrated major organizations all over the world. This is the breaking story of today. So, the power of social media. Think about the power of an organization like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. It's not a conventional NGO by any stretch of the imagination. But look at its influence in government, bureaucracy, and probably all walks of life. So the idea is that we are seeing a heteropolar world with all kinds of actors playing an important role, not just states or alliances between states, not just major corporations. The top 10 richest men in the people in the world control as much wealth as 50% of the world's population. So, in this scenario, I couldn't think of a better person to lead us through and give us an idea of the new world order than Lord Meghnad Desai. I must say that his family, the Desai family, comes from Vadnagar, where our own PM was born. He has a very strong Baroda connection. He was raised in Baroda. His family home was very near the Shanta Devi, I think, talkies. And he went to the Sayaji High School as a child before going to Mumbai and then to the University of Pennsylvania on a foundation. I want to say to Lord Desai, Meghnad bhai, હું પણ વડોદરાનો છું અને મારા પપ્પા ત્યાં કામ કરતા હતા નાનપણમાં હું વડોદરામાં જ હતો અને એ ઓલિમ્પિકમાં હતા નાનપણમાં અમે વડોદરામાં હતા અને મને પણ વડોદરાની યાદ આવે છે તો તમારી ચોપડી વાંચીને મને બહુ જ આનંદ થયો અને I welcome you from the bottom of my heart. And the last thing I want to say about Lord Desai, as I said, he's a polymath. He's written a wonderful book on Dilip Kumar, okay? And he looks at the progress of India's independence, the political economy, and the changing contours of Indian culture through the films of Dilip Kumar. So he's a film buff, he's a theater buff, he's a painter, he's a writer, he's a translator, he's an economist of international stature, he's specialized in econometrics. In fact, his PhD was on the tin economy. But he's not a tin pot lord, he's a life peer, though he has resigned from the Labour Party. Now it will free him to make some conservative noises which he was muzzled from making earlier, and I think point to some liberalizing measures in the very crucial Brexit transition. Thank you, Lord Desai, for joining us. All yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Makaran. Thank you very much. તમારો ઘણો ઘણો આભાર. And I'm fascinated from the way you have laid the introduction for heteropolarity. I mean, it's a very interesting concept because it is not just multipolarity, it's heteropolarity. Because, as you said, we started after the Second World War. In a bipolar world, Cold War. On one hand, there was America with its allies, and there was a Soviet Union. And much of the sort of second half of 20th century was kind of described by that. Let me say this, in a sense, uh, thinking of the world in terms of great powers is a European invention. If I may go just back a little bit, in 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, the British, along with the Prussians and Russians, defeated Napoleon. And then they had a Congress of Vienna. Now, the Congress of Vienna was where the powers of Europe decided to restore French monarchy and basically got together to kind of run the world. And the century from 1815 to 1914, 99 years, is called Pax Britannica, i.e. when Britain was keeping the world at peace, gold standard was the basis of all currency, and the Bank of England was the only institution which was a kind of the global central bank, rather like IMF is today. And that kind of set the model of how the dominant powers wanted the world to be run. That there had to be a dominant power which would settle the rules of international law, the rules of international commerce, the basis of the currency, and that was supposed to be a very solid period. Throughout that century, there was no inflation. Inflation was zero throughout that century. That century is called the long 19th century. But there we are. In 1914, the World War started. First World War started. And you can think of the rest of the 20th century as a way of sorting out the problems of European empires. See, basically, there were maritime empires where the headquarters was in Europe, but the empire was out there somewhere in Africa or Asia or Latin America. And so England and France and Belgium and Netherlands all had their empires abroad. Germany and Austria had that land Germany didn't really have an empire, but Austria had its empire there. Germany was already large but a powerful country. So basically, it was a land-based empires versus sea-based empires. And then in the First World War, the sea-based empires won. America came in halfway through the First World War and helped Britain. So that the Allies, in the Waterloo time, the Allies were the British, the Prussians, and the Russians. Now the Allies were America, UK, and France, and the Austrian Empire was dismembered into various countries, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. Indeed, what we call nationalism is really a 20th century product, because although there were some nations before France especially, nationalism in terms of a territory and a language and a sort of homogeneous culture, that idea is born from the breakup of the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Come the Second World War, the unhappiness of the Germans in not having their own empire and having to face French and British led to the rise of Hitler, and the Second World War was fought. The fascist powers, Italy and Germany plus Japan, versus, again, the same old gang, Britain, France, US. France, of course, surrendered early on in the Second World War. So the problems caused by the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and German ambition and so on led to the Second World War. Second World War was over. We then sorted out the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German problem. So what we started after the Second World War was this bipolar world in which there was a kind of allied empire of America, NATO, the NATO empire, as it were, and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was the last big Russian empire, the Tsarist empire, which had become communist. Now, between 1945 and 1991, let's say, roughly speaking, the Cold War lasted. And the Soviet Union collapsed without a single shot being fired. There's a very fascinating story as to why the Soviet Union fell apart without a single. But I would say that it was really because, in terms of economic performance, the Soviet Union failed to match up to the power of America. While the Soviet Union had very good armaments and things like that, it wasn't able to afford its people a proper standard of living. So what you have in the Second World War, after the Second World War, is this bipolar world, but a totally much higher level of killing power of the weaponry. The fact that America was able to explode the atom bomb and end the Second World War by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then it became a nuclear race at who was going to be the nuclear power. And very soon America was matched with the Soviet Union, and then we had the UK and France to be nuclear powers. Later on, China became a nuclear power, and the club of nuclear powers wanted to keep themselves in this monopoly position, but slowly the monopoly has broken out, and now there are about 10 countries, maybe 10, 11 countries with nuclear power, including India. And of course, now the only control is on the raw material which is needed. The technology is all well known, is the raw material, which is uranium is in short supply, and the powers that be, the nuclear powers, control the uranium. Now, so after 1991, we had as Macron said, we had a single big power, hyper power, as the French used to call it. The U.S. had won the Cold War. The U.S. thought it was now, the master of all. It surveyed, and this is only sort of 30 years ago we're talking about. The last 30 years have been very fascinating, because while America thought it was the most powerful country because there was no sort of opponent of the conventional sort left, we find now that the world is no longer well ordered in terms of two big powers, or necessarily only nuclear powers or big powers. Think of it this way, that what 9/11 did is basically confront America with a totally different challenge from what it had before. America was a military power, and with very good air power and naval power and nuclear. But in Asia, for example, America has never won a land war. It more or less lost in Korea, or it didn't win in Korea, and it lost in Vietnam. What 9/11 did was it opened America to a urban guerrilla warfare across the world without any particular political power. The Al-Qaeda was a completely modern, sort of innovative organization. What they call it was a flat organization. It had no hierarchy. Its